Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah, and I'm a PhD student at the Rotman, as I was just introduced. I'm a student of Asaf Gilboa's, where we usually study memory processes. And a recent question in the lab has been how prior knowledge influences how we learn and what we later remember. This project kind of fits within that scope, where we looked at how prior knowledge and statistical learning might both be contributing to the word learning process of novel words. So when you hear a novel word for the first time, let's say the word Katinga, you're going to have some prior knowledge, maybe that's nothing, but some relevant prior knowledge to help you in deciphering what that word means. So even if that's nothing, this can be represented by a prior distribution. If you hear a bit more about that word, such as it being used in a phrase like Katinga's nest in forest canopies, that provides you with a bit more information. You might infer that the Katinga is some kind of animal and perhaps a bird based off of the verb nest. So this information that you're gathering through experience is going to interact with the knowledge that you had prior to this experience and lead you to some updated knowledge base about what the word Katinga actually means. So the experience data that you gathered can be represented by a likelihood distribution, and your updated knowledge after you've incorporated that information can be represented by a posterior distribution. So what's really interesting about this kind of Bayesian workflow of learning is that your updated knowledge about what the word Katinga means will actually become your relevant prior knowledge the next time you've experienced that word. So it's actually kind of like a iterative process where your prior knowledge interacts with what you're gathering in the moment to give you an updated knowledge base. So we were interested in examining this iterative process by mathematically inferring participants' prior distributions throughout a word learning task. And the task was really similar to that workflow that we just walked through together. So I'll talk about the task in a bit more detail in a second, but we used their task accuracy as a proxy for their posterior distribution. And that's because we assumed that they would be making their selections in the task. They would be making the selections in the task based off of their updated knowledge from the information they're gathering in the experiment. In a separate group of participants, we also normed our stimuli so that we could kind of have a quantification of how much information the experiment was providing participants in learning these novel animals. So with participants' individual task accuracy and these kind of more broad norms for how informative our study was, we could then mathematically infer prior distributions for each participant at multiple time points throughout the task. So it's of note that these are across multiple items. They're not like item specific, but they are subject specific, these prior distributions that we're inferring. So I'll go into a bit more detail of all three of these things. We'll start with the task. Our word learning task was across 2 days. The first day was a learning phase where they first saw and heard the name of a novel animal, then a fact about it, and then they had to make a choice of which of 4 animals they thought was the target. So they never received any feedback, so it was all like an inferential learning. And there was always one known animal out of the 4, and that was to help guide their selections a bit, so they would hopefully just ignore the known animal. In this case, that's an owl. So they didn't receive any feedback, and they learned 20 targets this way, and they saw each about 12 times. My experiment has a mind of its own today. I'm so sorry. So they saw each target 12 times. And so we assumed that earlier on they would be relying more on their prior knowledge because these should be completely novel animals to them. But as they gained experience with them, we assumed they would make more informed inferences as they gain more knowledge about them. Another interesting point about our task is that the target and its label were always co-occurring across these 12 presentations, but the lures were always changing. So although we're interested in looking at how prior knowledge is involved in the learning process, people could also be using like a statistical learning strategy to the task as well. So on the first day, they learned these 20 targets, and then we had them come back the next day to do memory testing. I'm going to be talking about name recognition today, where they just saw the label and had to pick which one they thought was the target. And then we also asked them how confident they were in their selection. But I won't be talking about that today. In the norming study, the stimuli was almost identical. So the same pictures and facts were on the screen, but we would remove the label of the target. And this was in a separate group of participants. We asked them to rate how likely they thought each of the animals on screen was the one that was referenced in the sentence. And using these scores, we could then infer a quotient about how informative each trial was to selecting the target compared to the other unknown lure animals. So these norms were the same for all participants because they all saw the same experiment. And we could use that to infer participants' prior distributions throughout the task. So the main thing here about these prior distributions is that the shape is actually really informative for us for what's going on. So you can look at the expected value of a distribution, and that will tell it that's like the mean. But we also can look at the spread of the distribution, which kind of gives us an estimate of how certain that mean estimate is, if that makes sense. So you can have two distributions that look really similar, but the mean would be the same, and it's the standard deviation that will help us kind of disentangle these two. But again, because of time, I'm only going to be talking about the mean estimates today. Okay, so what we were interested in looking at was how do individual learning trajectories relate to memory performance the next day? So we wanted to look at how these prior means kind of changed across the task, as well as how their task accuracy changed. So we mapped their performance into a trajectory, and we fit a linear regression to it. And this gives us three pieces of information. The first is the intercept, which tells us where these values were at the very start of the experiment. So for task accuracy, that would be block 1, but for the prior means, that actually refers to their pre-experimental prior knowledge. And that's just based off of the Bayesian workflow that I explained at the beginning of my talk. So that's kind of like an estimate of their prior knowledge before they learn anything about these novel animals, which is really neat. We can also look at the slope of their trajectories, which just explains whether it's positive or negative, kind of like the rate of change across the task. And then we also have error term, which explains how linearly these changes were. So if someone had small adjustments that we see right now, maybe the error term would be a bit smaller. But if someone had more erratic changes in their learning trajectory, the error term would be bigger. So what we did for statistics in this task was actually we ran a series of regressions to see how these different features of learning trajectories related to next day memory performance. But that doesn't visualize very well or very easily. So we also ran a cluster analysis to see if there were any kind of groups or strategies people learned in the task. So we ran a k-means cluster analysis, finding k best fitting at 4. And we found these 4 kind of strategies in the task. And this cluster analysis is based off of their in-task selection accuracy. So you can see already that there's some big differences based on the intercepts. The yellow and blue group are a lot higher than the green and red. Based on that block 1. The slopes are all generally positive except for the red group, which doesn't seem to show much change across the task and are kind of hovering around chance. And then they also would have different error terms. So the blue group seems to have a pretty linear trajectory, whereas the other 3 would maybe have larger error terms. So that's just to orient us all to the kind of lingo I'm going to be using in a second. Okay, so here are the results. You can see our cluster analysis on the left, and then the prior means of participants. I also just grouped them based off this cluster for visualization, and then name recognition on the right. So there were 20 animals to learn, so 20 is ceiling. So our analyses found that the intercept term of prior means was positively predictive for name recognition. So those who had a higher prior mean did better at the memory testing the next day. And what's really interesting here is that we didn't find an intercept term predictive in the selection accuracy. So what I'm trying to say here is just that the prior mean terms, the people who had a higher prior mean, are actually different than those who just did the best in the first block. We're kind of looking at something unique here. So we found the intercept terms to be predictive for name recognition. We also found the error terms of the prior means to be predictive for name recognition. So those who had a straighter trajectory had better name recognition, like the yellow and blue groups. And then we also found that the slope of selection accuracy was predictive for name recognition. So that's more logical, where just those who did better in the task and could correctly infer the targets could actually remember them the next day. So in sum, the main takeaways from these results is that efficient use of pre-experimental prior knowledge promotes next day memory. It's also those who could incrementally update their knowledge across the task had better memory. So that kind of suggests that you need to integrate across your experiences with all of the information you're gathering. Our cluster analysis suggested that different people apply different strategies in the word learning task, but the optimal strategy seems to be those who could both use and update their prior knowledge. So although not everyone seems to be like a Bayesian learner, at least in our task, in our pool of participants, those who did use a kind of Bayesian learning strategy seem to have the best memory in the end. Okay, that's it for me. I just would like to thank my supervisors, Asaf and Malcolm, and our collaborators, Jed and Eve. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah. Very interesting. Are there questions?
Ooh.
Maybe I can ask a naive question. What makes you more efficient in using the prior knowledge?
Efficient.
Efficient, yes. Is it the prior knowledge itself, just having a lot of it, or is it some sort of a trait that makes you more or less efficient in using it and becoming a better learner this way?
Yeah, I don't know if we can necessarily disentangle that with our task right now, but our informativeness rating is based off of general knowledge about animals at large, like how birds typically nest, but also some mammals nest, like that kind of stuff. So we assume that everyone kind of had a similar base general knowledge, and it's just those who are actually applying it in the task.
Yeah, thank you. Have you tried assessing their knowledge of specific areas? I presume these were not only birds, these were different areas, but maybe you try to get an idea of where they were, I don't know, having better grades in biology in high school or other things.
Yeah, I don't think we actually measured that, but we did have a norming study before this task was created.
That's in different subjects, right?
Yeah, and it was based on finding the most novel animals, so animals people wouldn't have heard of before.
Right.
In North America, at least.